Hi everyone, thank you for joining with us today. We're going to wait just a few more moments for a few more folks to sign on. Thanks. Hi everyone, welcome to the TBR Webinar series. Today, Principal Analyst Geoff Woollacott and Analyst Stephanie Long will be discussing quantum computing leaps into customers' transformation-centric conversation. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. At the bottom of your screens, you can access the slides, audio controls, Q&A, speaker bios, and our survey. After the webinar, you will receive an email with a replay link as well as a link to view and register for other TBR webinars. If you have any questions for us, please submit them via the Q&A widget in On24. You may also reach out to us after the event at webinars@tbri.com. Thank you again for joining us, and here's Stephanie to begin the webinar.
All right. Thanks, Sarah, and thanks everybody for joining today. So as Sarah mentioned, my name is Stephanie Long. I'm an analyst on the data center team and the lead analyst on TBR's quantum computing research, and I'm joined by Geoff Woollacott, Senior Strategy Consultant and Principal Analyst, exploring a lot of the emerging technologies in this space, including quantum computing. So we're excited to share with you some insights from our new quantum computing market landscape, and that's a semi-annual report that has been quite interesting to develop, and so we hope you enjoy learning a bit about what we have uncovered in this market. And so we're going to start this webinar, we're going to sort of go from the inside out, and what I mean by that is that we're going to deep dive into some of the insights from this report first, and then we'll take a step back and position it in the larger IT landscape. So let's get started. So here we are showing the main phases of the quantum computing market that we foresee over the next few decades. We're currently in the quantum readiness phase, where vendors and customers alike are preparing their organizations for quantum computing, which takes on many different shapes and sizes, that preparation phase. So we believe some organizations have entire teams dedicated to focusing on quantum computing capabilities. Some have small tiger teams keeping a pulse on the technology, and then there are others that don't see the value in investing in quantum computing quite yet. And we think that the vendors and organizations that have not even designated a few people to at least explore quantum computing on the side run a significant risk of being left behind. And while it is true that quantum computing isn't really commercially available at a large scale yet, we can tell from the innovations that have happened over the past few years that the development's going to be rapid once key milestones are reached, and therefore it's going to be hard to jump on that train once it leaves the station and catch up with peers that have invested in the technology in advance of that commercial availability. So the next phase we have here is what TBR has termed economic advantage. And that's a term that we've coined to help define the inflection point for quantum computing. And we define economic advantage as the point at which either the time to insight is dramatically improved or an insight otherwise unattainable using classical computing only is able to be achieved. So these provide a significant advantage leveraging quantum instead of just classical computing. And I want to note that we do not see quantum computing as operating entirely independently in order to achieve this economic advantage in the near future, at least. And we see quite the opposite, actually. We are envisioning economic advantage being achieved by a hybrid of classical with quantum, where classical will be used, and then when the point in the computation is reached that it can benefit from being run on quantum, it'll be transferred over to the quantum computer and then back to classical to finish that computation. So this is how we envision economic advantage playing out in the near term anyway. And economic advantage will also be achieved one algorithm at a time. And that's simply an advantage over the classical computation, so some algorithms will achieve it while others still haven't yet. And we see that happening within the next 2 to 5 years. And so the third phase we have here is adoption at scale. And so we think that'll be within the next decade or two. And we don't think that quantum's initial adoption at scale will be of physical hardware. It's likely to be through the cloud, except there will be some niche uses where the on-premise system is going to be necessary for like security reasons or otherwise. So it'll be extremely costly to do that and therefore won't be the norm in that time frame. But at this phase, we believe this is when having laid the groundwork for quantum safe security will also prove to be a worthwhile investment. Because once the technology becomes more widely available, bad actors are likely to look to exploit it for malicious purposes. We see that with all sorts of technology. So investing to protect yourself ahead of that curve, we're seeing is likely to be advantageous, especially for industries where they have highly sensitive data like healthcare or banking. That's going to be desirable to those malicious actors. Okay, so this is just a different view of similar insights from that previous slide we just talked about. But here you can see a bit more nuances to those details. So, for example, we believe that in the next 3 to 5 years, quantum safe security investments are going to start ramping up. And we think this will happen slightly ahead of the quantum becoming mainstream because, as I mentioned on the previous slide, companies with highly sensitive information like banking and healthcare will need to get out ahead of that threat to prevent that data loss. And so we have heard from some quantum safe security vendors that we've talked to that that investment from the initial investment to the full quantum safe environment, it can take about 3 years. So we think, therefore, that folks at these particular verticals, as an example, are likely to invest about that much ahead of the adoption at scale curve. Okay, so I know we talked about economic advantage already, but I wanted to reiterate that point on this slide as well. And that's a very important inflection point in the market, so I wanted to emphasize it. And the key here is the fact that once an algorithm achieves economic advantage, there's likely to be innovation to find ways to apply that same algorithm to other problems, potentially in other industries. And so it's essential to the rapid development of the technology and is why that point about economic advantage is so important. And so the next point on this slide, it pertains to the sheer volume of possibility with quantum. The opportunity is vast, and there are unlikely suspects investing in the technology to capitalize on that as a result. So the most notable example we have here is Honeywell. It's not a vendor you would necessarily expect to be investing in this type of technology, but the applicability of it throughout its own capabilities makes it useful for both in-house capabilities, but also the potential to monetize those capabilities as well as using them internally. And that's sort of, if you think about it, how AWS is looking at monetizing its infrastructure that it has underlying its cloud when it goes to market with those outposts. Okay, so the last point I have on this slide is how innovation is largely driven by investment. Now that makes a whole lot of sense if you think about it, because where the money is where the innovation will be. But here's the thing with that. So the government is a major funder of that innovation. And when governments from different countries invest in a technology to make major life-changing breakthroughs, the investments and the innovation become even faster. So we've seen this happen before in history, and we at TBR think that the capabilities of quantum are such that it could spark similar investment trends. Okay, so to the last point I made on that prior slide, innovation is driven a lot by the investments being made in the technology. So in addition to government driving a fair bit of innovation, we're also seeing it driven a fair bit by the sciences and the financial industry. And we also believe that the initial adoption phase will be completed within the next 10 years. That means that the folks with the small tiger teams exploring the technology passively, or the small sampling of customers jumping in with both feet, will begin to accelerate within the next decade. And the early innovators will have an advantage of unique vertical-specific breakthroughs that will be made since they are investing ahead of some of their peers. So this is a risk that customers and vendors alike run if they choose to hold off on at least a passive or minor exploration of the technology. If their peers are investing ahead of the curve, they run that risk of being overtaken in a sense. Okay, so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Geoff to talk more about the overall state of the market.
Yeah, leave it on this for a bit. Thank you, Stephanie. Now we're going to pivot a little bit. What I'm going to show you are 3 slides, quite frankly, that have been iterated upon by me from 1986 until today, and the evolution of that thinking. And then lastly, I'll put up a slide that I've been struggling with for 18 months. I'm not terribly happy with it in its current form, but it's my effort to put in context what the business impact of quantum can be and can unleash. And I make that statement because I am increasingly more convinced that the economic period we're in today is something that historians will look back on for centuries. I am utterly convinced of this. We are at the dawn of the 4th Industrial Revolution. The 3rd Industrial Revolution triggered all sorts of things in the 1840s to 1860s. There were populist uprisings. We had a civil war. We came out of it with greater economic capacity, greater ability to produce goods, more rapid, we stripped out more and more human toil or manual labor out of the economy. And what we're doing today is we're doing the same thing that was there for the sort of the laborers in the field, for lack of a better word, and we're stripping that out of trust, we're stripping that out of dispute resolution, we're stripping it out of all sorts of things that, as a managing partner at a services firm at an analyst conference summed it up eloquently, is if you are not at the point of consumption or at the point of creation, ultimately your job will not be as necessary. That's not to say they all go away, but the employment levels will drop dramatically. And what we know typically is business with the profit motive first goes for optimization so that the labor reductions will come ahead of determining ways to expand the workforce with new and different services. The first thing is to prove the value through a cost takeout because it's much more tangible and it's easier to sell to management, and then it's to look at innovation around new business and new models. So we're at a societal rebirth. We have different ways that we interact socially, as we see from Facebook and all those other wonderful things. We have different ways that we are to work. As somebody has said, it isn't that AI will replace managers, but managers who lean on and work with AI will replace managers who do not. And then lastly, the third leg of that stool is the need for public policy to shift. And we are seeing it throughout the world that our leaders are struggling with trying to figure out how to do that. So that's just sort of a a topological overview. Now let's hop into these slides to try to start going down the historical context. This piece on the left was first shown me on a whiteboard in the 80s by my business mentor as we were taking a look at mini computers and how they were cratering as PCs were coming through. He also was providing me with the historical context of what happened in the 60s and 70s with mainframes and the consolidation of that space and so on and so forth as distributed computing rose and minis came into the fore. The basic construct here is that you had four different elements of the IT industry, and the rise and fall of the different cycles of innovation or choke points put investment and had businesses rise and fall around compute, storage, the I/O, and then the network that was connecting it all in together. The only real change I've made to that diagram as I've been struggling to make the leap since cloud came into the fore is on the right-hand side. And what I've really done there is just to say networking and machine I/O, because human access is now ubiquitous through all sorts of mobile devices, Wi-Fi communication, direct access, etc. So the human piece, you can have lights out data centers that just run. So the only change I made to that historical context was to kind of consolidate it down to three, eliminating the human input onto this side. And really, at this point in time, Intel is working on that integration. We have distributed computing at the board level, soon to be at the chip level. All of this is going on. The miniaturization has brought it down to a very small board that ultimately will be able to fit into a smartphone before I've retired from the industry. So this piece I struggled with from about 05 to, frankly, a presentation made by Paul Moritz at an EMC World Conference that gets us to the next slide a little bit, where it was around 2014. You can't really see it that well, but in 2014, sitting during his keynote, a statement he made was that the data monetization fabric of the industry had changed from that which I showed you on the prior slide to what is in the purple on the right hand of the upper top part of that slide, which is apps, data, and analytics. It was completely abstracted or primarily extracted from silicon. And as you can see for 2014, I was sitting there going, well, the integration, I'm not quite sure what it is. So to acknowledge my own lack of knowledge, I just put in a top hat with smoke coming out of it to say I had to figure it out. The bottom right, around 17, I had started to figure out more and more of what went into that center, I call it the center square, the bottom right one I call a barbell slide. And ultimately I just said, really all I need to put there is yes. That the more and more that this is sort of the multi-cloud manager, this is a control plane, this is serverless compute, this is, CI/CD, it's you name it, it goes into there. And so finally, what I'm going to show you is what is my current version of this thing on the next slide, where that center wheel, the red, I was trying to create an engine to think of the flywheel effect, the network effect of the ecosystem and the flywheel and on and on. And it has three pieces there that are fundamental, particularly going to the left in the silicon. Virtualization, standardization, open source, OpenStack, Cloud Foundry, however you want to define it, virtualization, standardization, automation. And when you're dealing with zeros and ones coursing through electric current, that's easy to do. Now to the right-hand side, which is people and process changes, arguably you do not have virtualization, but you need standardization to get to automation. So that's global business rules. That's blockchain smart contracts. Standardization, you can therefore have automation. So to that point, human error is sand in the gears of that flywheel effect if you cannot get those things set. It is, in my opinion, the rise of the traditional tax and audit firms into services. They have more permission to play on understanding the details business rules and being able to give they've got a seat at the boardroom table to help with establishing the global processes. Blockchain is getting in there as well. Those red threads that are running around the gears, think of them as fan belts. I had three things in there. I had data management, the user interface, so that's where the human's involved now. We can touch it from just about any spot, and security. That's the red thread of the fibers of that fan belt that drive it around. Now, up top, I put in quantum, sort of up and above in the known unknowns. Now, the three intersects I have there are subject to change, I would imagine. Right now, what I have in there are the APIs, building the bridges to use the classical, take advantage of the current applications, be able to add. I mean, the quantum in and of itself doesn't do much unless you have the algorithm to tell it what to do. As one of the briefings Stephanie and I were on, the person equated quantum to just a big dumb machine, and without the algorithm, it doesn't know what to do. So that algorithm development is going to be critical. The sort of breaking it up, or in my head, it's like a Mad Lib where the value of quantum is to be able to compare a greater number of variables. It's more about the number of variables necessarily that you want to compare at once, as opposed to the size of the data set. So I'm thinking of distributed algorithms. You're not quite sure if you want to get it up to quantum, but you'll take it up there to get kind of the big bimodal cut and bring it back down, use it in classical, and on down the line. But those are the three things that we have in there now. It's laying the compilers, the runtimes, getting all those standardized automated procedures set to be able to make the translation up to quantum and back. Now, I'll kind of pause. That was a quick summarization of what I've been thinking about from this construct for at least a decade, if not longer. But the next slide, I will tell you in advance, I'm not terribly happy with it. I am working diligently to try to find a way to get better mathematical compares to it. But it's to try to put quantum in context in terms of what's it going to do to time to insight? How much faster are we going to be able to innovate? So leaving it just as it is now, I'll give you the source data points that I have put together. They're all anecdotal. The first two from 2012, it was a briefing by an IBM executive in Spain. I just decided to attend a CMOS breakout because I hadn't really looked at hardware very much in the last couple of years and wanted to see what was going on. And at the end, near the end of the presentation, he basically said that CMOS had enough life for a 100,000-fold improvement over 20 years. That's why you see 2012 to 2032. Sitting in the audience, that was not anything that I found shocking. It was pretty much consistent with what I'd been hearing since the 80s when I was attending these hardware briefings. It was like, okay, Moore's Law still got some legs, was my thinking at the time. Then he added cognitive, which is the green line, which is a millionfold or a 10x improvement. I don't want to say price performance. I can't remember the exact term I used at the time. That's why we now use time to insight. The idea being when the user pushes the button to when they get back their answer, 100,000-fold improvement from silicon, a millionfold or a 10x bend to that curve when you add cognitive. Now, the last line that goes straight up and down is what I heard when I was presenting at a quantum conference in October of 17 from one of the quantum purveyors. I can't remember which one, but it was that ceteris paribus, all of the things equal. When we put it up on quantum, it was 1,000,000 times faster. So I, at least, have lived through the 50 years of Moore's Law, which looks like pales in comparison to both the bend from cognitive, and then the straight up line is the only way I can really show it at scale, proper scale, of what quantum's going to be able to bring. And that is what fascinates me. Here we are. We're on the dawn of this fourth industrial revolution. We understand what we've done economically, socially, etc., over the last 50 years, working on a improvement scale that's in that purple line. And we are a year or two away from starting to catch hold of that red line. So right now, we know that there are these known knowns, and we will optimize these things with blockchain technologies, you know, AI, IoT, smart supply chains, censoring of more data. We can do that with what we've got going on. Then, on the next progressions is you have those known unknowns that have been solved with advancements in analytics, but every once in a while they're kind of hitting, we'll call it that solid green line where classical can't handle it. So there's a certain point at which the complexity of that algorithm is banging up against what we're able to do with, we'll call it Moore's Law, and the extension or the boosting of Moore's Law as it runs near the physical limits of how thin can you make a silicon wafer, where we're using distributed computing. I mean, we're doing distributed computing on chips, FPGAs, GPUs, TPUs, you name it. We're doing distributed computing on the chip level, which is, you know, giving it a little more life. But we will also have quantum that will be able to take those applications and burst it. Then we have those known unknowns that are just waiting for the commercial grade quantum. I mean, there's people dying to get their hands on it, to take their natural inquisitiveness and run these tests so that the iteration cycles, in theory, are 1,000,000 times faster than what they would be. Another anecdote that was from a Microsoft quantum video I saw 2 years ago, where what they were talking about is their innovations around their own quantum design, as well as their innovations in the algorithm development. So I can't tell you how much is attributable to both, but over 3 years, they took something that they forecast it would take, it was like 23 or 24 billion years to calculate under the current construct, and in 3 years' time, they brought that down to 1 hour. 20-odd billion years to an hour. The potential, the impact is it's just fascinating to try to figure out what is it that we're going to be able to solve based on what technology is doing. And with any of these iterations, there's always great good that can come from these things, and similarly, in the hands of the black hats, there can be things that are great difficulties. So the next 10 to 20 years are going to be volatile. They are going to have, you know, fits and starts and stops on different proof of concept tests, on different trials. We will have better medicines. We will have better scientific understandings. We will have better designed products. Hopefully it can be applied to things like climate. It will be used in financial investments for monetary gain. But there is great good that is coming, and it's coming from our industry. We're an industry that has lived and understood rapid rise and fall of businesses and asymmetric competition, creative destruction. If you've lived in this industry more than a decade, you have lived through it. And we are now bringing that to all sorts of commercial industries as a result of the lower cost of what we can do with Moore's, as well as what this profound leap in productivity is going to bring to bear on companies who are fearless enough to embrace it, start to experiment with it, and bring new products and services to market. It is a fascinating time to be studying economics and business. And as I say, I hate to sound, I don't know, like a religious zealot, but the world is going to look back at this era for centuries as a result of what this is going to bring. And That's why we're fascinated to have this first iteration of the quantum market landscape. The second one will have some new features as we go. We're learning as we go. We're taking a look at all sorts of different pieces, how they integrate together. It's as much the services, it's as much the optimizations or the wrapper around quantum of the conventional systems or classical systems that'll be queuing up the workloads or storing the data that will be ingested for the compares. So there's a whole host of cascading implications, but the key one is the idea that we'll have a processing unit or a computing unit that is 1,000,000 times faster than anything we have today. And with that, I'll come up for air and take a look to see if we have any questions, and also turn it back over to Stephanie.
Yeah, okay. So thanks, Geoff. So that concludes the planned part of our presentation today. So we'll give it a few minutes for you to send some questions in using that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. But while we're waiting, I also wanted to mention to you that Geoff and I will be at Quantum Tech in September in Boston. So if you are planning on attending and you'd like to connect with us, please drop a note here or email me, and I'd be glad to connect with you to coordinate a time for us to meet in person and chat further on our insights into the quantum space.
There is a question here about the slide of flywheels, and it says, yes, but the characteristics of highly are well defined. You're talking about a lot of custom development to reach the least common denominator capability. I'm not sure I fully understand. I certainly agree that there is a need for custom development. That is really for those that are in the sort of conventional space, close to the box consultancies, services, close to the box services firms, almost like in the 1968 movie The Graduate, where the older gent comes up and says he has one word for him: plastics. One of my standard taglines to these folks is, at a minimum, it's you can't necessarily go out and start breaking ground on a new quantum development architecture. There's folks that have decades head starts on you, but you can start developing those tiger teams that start working on the development and the toolkits and the layers in order to be able to get it done, such that when early adopters finally start to, catch a rocket here, they can at least have people that can start doing some of that custom development, understanding the quantum programming and the different runtimes and compilers to bridge for the, I'll call it, early majority that realize that early adopters got a huge head start on them in some domain area. So that is one of the ways that services can be done. The least common denominator capability, I'm also thinking of it as smart contracts for consistent data management, which was one of those red thread fibers on the fan belt of that thing, is the idea that you've got to have consistent data. If you're wasting your time doing data wrangling and trying to join it because you haven't been able to herd the cats of the business actors to use a standard data construct, that cost will not be able to be recovered when you're competing against those who are able to gain consensus on the smart contracts. That will just put you at a competitive disadvantage. So there was that one. You've got
Yep.
Stephanie's got one too.
So the next question here is, what are the hardware technologies that see the most promise? So I'll caveat this answer with, in many cases, it's sort of too soon to tell with certainty on that one. But what I can tell you is what we're seeing now. So what we're seeing now is that the superconducting hardware is ahead on the developments, but we also see the ion trap hardware that has a significant amount of promise as well to compete with the superconducting architectures. And a key advantage the ion trap has is that it doesn't necessarily require those really cold temperatures to function. And so that might prove to be an advantage in the long term, but it's too soon to tell with certainty which of these competing architectures in the quantum hardware space is going to end up reigning supreme.
Want the CGI?
So we have this next question here. Interested in the disruptive effects of cryptography use, and in particular, if this is a specific issue for elliptic curve. So I don't know, Geoff, if you have anything to add on that one.
Well, the cryptography, we're certainly hearing lots of concerns about that. We're hearing it in quantum encryption keys. We've heard of quantum encryption keys as having the potential to wind up within 5 years, near term, I was going to say, as almost a Y2K kind of run on professional services to help. That the first thing that people should do to be ready for quantum cryptography is to double the, what is it called, the security encryption key file, because they need to be longer. And this is actually, it's something that we're intending to hone in a little bit further on in the next iteration around security and what are the provisioning that's going on there. I don't know if you want to add a little more.
Yeah. So we are seeing that the quantum safe security piece of this market is one that is developing pretty swiftly. We do see that there are a lot of customers starting to look at what do we need to do to prepare ourselves for when quantum computing takes off. So in addition to preparing customers to take advantage of the capability itself, also prepare to protect themselves against the negative implications of that same capability. And that's something that we are actually seeing. These services vendors that may not necessarily be innovating around quantum specifically do have an opportunity to take advantage of that need by customers. As we talked about in the beginning of the webinar, once quantum takes off, the developments are going to be rapid, and having the services vendors armed to help customers that may not have been as interested in it at the time catch up. Okay, so we have another question here. It says, will different hardware architectures coexist? And based off of what we're seeing, it is conceivable that multiple hardware architectures could exist in the market and provide value. So no, we don't necessarily think that only one of the quantum computing hardware theories is going to be what remains. It is definitely a possibility that there could be multiple architectures coexisting in the market.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if I should add or not. Stephanie was on a roll, but when I take a look at, history may not repeat itself, but it sure can rhyme, is if you look at the mainframe space in the 70s, 80s, 90s, there was Cray that had a very unique value proposition. IBM and General Purpose would, they'd play leapfrog on price performance as they would go. Tandem had a unique value proposition for fault tolerance until the commoditization, Moore's Law move brought it down into sort of just Intel chips, and so then they went away. So there will be these, I believe there'll be these sort of leapfrogs in different price performance claims. And if it's 1 million times faster, once you've locked in on one, I don't know how much difficulty it'll be to move from one to the other, but clearly for a while there will be competing flavors, for lack of a better word, to get to that performance capability, and then over time you'll see the consolidations, and it'll come down to one or two in 25, 30 years, something like that.
Alrighty, so this next question says, what is the realistic timeline to have quantum computing commercially available outside of a research setting? So what we're seeing here is commercially available, but at some semblance of a scale. We're seeing that that'll likely happen within the next 10 years. There are already some quantum computers available for use. They're all available via the cloud at this time. We do think that that's going to be the way that quantum is consumed for the foreseeable future, where the quantum systems require very specific environments to function without all of that background noise interfering with its production. Having an on-premise system is not likely to happen in the near term. I don't know.
No, I don't disagree. Question for the speakers. You want to go in?
Sure. Okay, so this next one, when do you think those tiger teams and early adopters, like what types of job roles or functions do you see as most involved at this time? Developers, architects, etc. So I can start on this one, and if Geoff, you could add on. But so what we're seeing a lot is data scientists actually seem to be people that are classically trained that'll be taking advantage of quantum, as well as software developers. So. Right.
This is Geoff. Yeah. Well, there's two different pieces, I think. One is the developer side, and that's really going to be done at scale through standardization and automation, right? It's going to lay down the tracks, the runtimes, the compilers, and everything to bring classical up and over, for lack of a better word, over into the quantum side. Then you have the data scientists who know how to work with the algorithms. So that one, over time, that data scientist is, if you run this out 40 or 50 years, where is value going to be if most of other things have been standardized and we have just sort of utility computing, however you want to think about it? It's going to be the person who can come up with that mathematical formula, for lack of a better word, to take advantage of compute to come up with a new insight. Now, to get that done, however, you need the knowledge management expert, the one with the muscle memory, the one with the natural inquisitiveness to know, what if we looked at this and this together? And then the data scientist translates that. So there'll be that human translation. Early Tiger teams will be working on the implications. The early developers will be laying down the tracks, gaining that familiarity. Then it'll be, once that is done, so you can bridge to the old, they're going to be valuable early. Then it'll be the data scientists. So the various freeware trials and the various regional consortiums right now, largely with academic institutions, where the newly minted, newly degreed employees will be coming from as well. That's the hub today. And then once there's those sort of proven use cases, it'll be more and more the knowledge expert, two in a box, married up with a data scientist, in my opinion.
All right, we'll pause for a minute to see if any other questions will roll in. Okay, so the next question is, what do you think the quantum computing ecosystems will look like 5 to 10 years from now?
Well, it may be, and the individual asked a question and followed up to say, or is that too early for ecosystems? I was thinking in my head it might be a little premature, but you will have these partnerships. You've already got some of the partnerships. You have the partnerships with academic institutions doing pure research. working in collaboration both with the technology providers as they gain better understanding of how to optimize the overall system, the quantum system, which includes, classical computer controllers and disk store and, all these wonderful things. So you'll have them working closely together, and then there'll be the businesses for, I would say, primarily scientific research, so new materials, new drugs, and so on. In the beginning, it'll probably work in that way because of those innovations. Now, dropping back from that is the ways in which we're hearing quantum can be used for route optimizations, the traveling salesman's dilemma. Again, how many different variables and how quickly can you pull that together? There could start to be some partnerships there where, I'm making all this up, but UPS uses it, but now those who are doing innovations for autonomous vehicles may want to partner with UPS to understand the value of that algorithm and how they could apply it at scale for smart cities and, routing and all that other stuff, which in the beginning can happen in cities because of the dense, the need for more densely compacted networking transmits and over the course of it to beam the signals as 5G narrows down the range, meaning Wyoming may not have driverless cars before New York City and metros do, et cetera. So some of those things will start to come together, and you'll just see some I don't want to call them odd partnerships, but partnerships at first glance that don't seem to make sense. But because we're entering this era of disruptive change in terms of business model excellence, we're going to start seeing some folks start to partner up. I mean, I think it's Lockheed and Google are partnered up with a D-Wave system, and you think of Lockheed as traditional aerospace and Google as one of the fangs, and you sit there kind of looking at it sideways a bit, but they both need this big thing. Google for fast search, Lockheed for what would be traditional scientific or security reasons, and they just need access to the processing power, and I'm not sure if I should say processing, but compute power. So I guess I kind of wandered in circles there. I don't know if I answered the question specifically, but there will be ecosystems aligning both from that pure research perspective, and it's a draw for students, and then those who would avail and want to hire those students as they come out, as well as then the systems componentry that have to come together to create the quantum environment that attaches as it does in what I call the engine slide that I showed. Questions, right?
Okay, so if you have any further questions, please feel free to send them along. If we haven't answered your question live, we will follow up with you after the webinar to chat further. And thanks again for joining today. I hope you enjoyed it.
All right, everyone, please feel free to reach out to us with any follow-up questions you may have. If you have a few moments, we would appreciate if you could fill out the survey on your screen. A replay version of the webcast will be available after the event and will be sent out to you via email. To view a list of our upcoming and past webinars, please visit tbri.com. Be sure to join us Wednesday, August 14th for the Evolving Battleground for Winning Private Cloud Customers. Thank you and have a great day.